In this video, you're going to learn the details about the menstrual cycle and including the hormones and the processes that happens in or during the cycle. Before we start with the menstrual cycle, let's review the female reproductive system a little bit. You have learned that the inner lining of the uterus is the endometrium lining. It is not a permanent lining. It is a layer that can slough off every month, and also it is the place where the embryo can implant itself. This layer is very rich with blood vessels, and it can send the oxygen and other nutrients needed by the embryo or the growing embryo. The next structure that I want you to focus on is the ovary. The ovary is attached to the uterus from the outside, and it's located very closely to the fallopian tube opening. Every month, there will be one mature egg released by the ovary, and it will be transferred to the fallopian tube. And if there is an sexual intercourse, then fertilization may happen. If the egg is not fertilized, then after about 5 days, it will start to die and it will be ejected out from the body, including with the old endometrium lining. To produce a new generation is very important. So that's why this endometrium lining has to be refreshed or renewed every month. The old endometrium lining will slough off or ejected out from the body through the process that we know as menstruation. After the menstruation is over, a new egg will soon be released and a new endometrium lining will be produced again. So this process happens in a cycle repeated every like almost about 28 days, and this is what we call the menstrual cycle. So in these pictures, you can see more details about the implantation of the embryo into the endometrium lining. Now, the endometrium lining is a layer that is not permanent and it's very rich in blood vessels. So you can see from these three pictures how the embryo can start to develop its placenta. And from the last picture, you can see that the blood vessels of the embryo and the blood vessels of the mother are located very closely. So the diffusion of oxygen and also other molecules such as nutrients can happen very quickly and efficiently. In this slide, you can see the animation of the menstrual cycle that happens from day 1 up to, on average, day 28th, right? So you can see how the endometrium lining is getting thicker after the menses, all right, or the menstruation period, and then and then the egg will be released, mature and released from the ovary, and if there is no fertilization, it means that the menstruation will happen again. The animation that you watch from the previous slide looks very simple, but actually the processes that makes it possible during the menses is very complex, and it not just involves the uterus and the ovary, but also our brain, especially or specifically the hypothalamus. In which that the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland produces the two hormones that are very important to regulate the hormones in the ovary and to make sure that all these menstruation processes can happen. So in this slide, you can see there are 4 different diagrams in this picture, and usually people use these 4 diagrams to illustrate what happens during the process of menstrual cycle. So the first diagram is represent the two hormones produced by the hypothalamus, right? The pituitary gland in the hypothalamus of the brain. There are two hormones very important to regulate the menstrual cycle produced by the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland of hypothalamus, which are the follicle stimulating hormones of or FSH and luteinizing hormone or LH. And these hormones, as you can see, they fluctuate along the process or the cycle of the menstruation. The second graph is called the ovarian cycle. This graph shows what happened inside the ovary during the menstrual cycle. Now, you can see from the right side picture, it is the anatomy of the ovary. The ovary of a female contains lots of immature eggs, and every month there will be one egg selected to get mature and ready to be fertilized during the ovulation. The immature egg is kept inside a follicle, and follicle is the outer layer structure of an egg that protects the egg. Um, when it is triggered to develop by the follicle stimulating hormone or FSH, it will start to produce estrogen hormone while it is growing. Now, after the egg is released, the follicle will be changed into corpus luteum by the hormone luteinizing hormone or LH, and this corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone hormones. And the function of those two hormones are to develop or to make the endometrium lining thicker. The third diagram is the ovarian hormone levels. Here, as I have mentioned before, that the developing follicle produces estrogen. You can see from the third diagram as the red line, and then the corpus luteum or the yellow structure that looks like a popcorn, it produces two different hormones, which are the progesterone and estrogens. And both hormones, as I have mentioned before, they are responsible in maintaining and thickening the endometrium lining. And the last one, the fourth diagram, it shows the process of sloughing off and thickening of the endometrium lining during the cycle. And these two processes are regulated by the ovarian hormones, which are the estrogen and progesterone. I hope now you know the meaning of each diagram in this picture. Now let's learn the processes that happens within these four diagrams during the menstrual cycle. Let's start with step 1, which is from day 0 to day 7. So from day 0 to 7, menstruation is happening. You can see the green number 1 on the picture that I have written there. That's illustrate how the endometrium lining is sloughing off during the menstruation. And you may have learned before in the previous slides that estrogen and progesterones are the two hormones that maintain the thickening or the layer, the endometrium lining. Now, sloughing off, of course, indicates that the estrogen and progesterones levels are very low. That's number 2 on the diagram. Now, while menstruation is happening, actually a new egg has to be prepared. So you can see from number 3, the follicle stimulating hormone or FSH increases to stimulate development of a follicle in the ovary so that a new mature egg will be available after the menstruation is over. Now, from the ovarian cycle diagram, you can see there is a follicle that is growing, and a growing follicle produces estrogen. That's why for number 4, you can see that the red line of the estrogen hormone level in the ovarian hormone levels diagram, number 3, okay, graph number 3, is starts to increase. And this estrogen gives a negative feedback to FSH. You can see from the picture, I put a red line, a red arrow with number five, the purpose of suppressing FSH while estrogen is increasing is to make sure that there is only one follicle developed at one time. Because actually, the most optimum condition for pregnancy is one baby at a time or one embryo growing. Because why? Otherwise the embryo will start to compete for nutrients and oxygen and so on. So according to the evolutionary process of our ancestors, the best surviving pregnancy is the one that only contain one embryo at a time. So now the second step, which is from day 8 to day 14. The menstruation is over, and then step number one, endometrium lining is now getting thicker because the estrogen level is getting higher, as you can see from number two. This estrogen level keeps on increasing because the size of the follicle is also increasing. So the larger follicle definitely produces more estrogen. Until at certain point the follicle reaches its maximum size and the estrogen level also reaches its maximum size. Now with number five, it is a very interesting phenomenon that now is no longer a negative feedback, but it becomes a positive feedback. Very high estrogens will cause the FSH to increase slightly, and the next hormone that we haven't talked about is the LH in the pituitary will significantly increase. This is a form of positive feedback. And it is for a reason. Why? Because the LH, a very high or burst of LH, will trigger the follicle to burst, as you can see from number 6. LH causes the maximum size follicle to rupture and release the egg. Okay, high level of LH. This process is called ovulation. The female is now in a fertile period and she can get pregnant if a sperm fertilizes the egg. The next step happens between day 15 to day 21. First step, after the follicle bursts out to release the egg into, the egg will be transferred to the fallopian tube and there is a chance for the egg to be fertilized. The remaining follicle itself will be changed into a structure called corpus luteum by the LH. This corpus luteum, unlike the follicle that only produces estrogen, this corpus luteum produces two hormones, ovarian hormones, which are the progesterone and estrogen. And as has been mentioned in the previous slide, both hormones make the endometrium lining thicker to anticipate a possible pregnancy. They have to be ready because why? A fertile or an egg, a mature egg, is now available in the fallopian tube, ready to be fertilized. The endometrium lining also has to be thicker so that if implantation happens anytime, it's already available for the embryo to do the process. Now, then the last step is the combination of estrogen and progesterone give a negative feedback to FSH and LH. You can see from arrow number 4. This to ensure that during this fertile period, there is no more new egg produced by the ovary. So there is only one possible pregnancy. And this is the last step of the menstrual cycle. Here, you have to know that the menstrual cycle keeps on happening if there is no pregnancy. So in this case, let's assume there is no fertilization. So step 1, if fertilization doesn't take place, the corpus luteum start to degenerate. That's number 1. So it's getting smaller and smaller, right? Because it doesn't have a long lifespan. So smaller corpus luteum, of course, produces lower amount of estrogen and progesterone, as you can see from arrow number 2. Now, due to the negative feedback of between the progesterone and estrogen versus the LH and FSH, the low amount of estrogen and progesterone causes the FSH and LH to increase. Okay, and because there is not enough amount of estrogen and progesterone, then the endometrium lining cannot be maintained. So the next thing that will happen is this cycle will go back to the first day, which is day zero, in which menstruation happens. The endometrium lining slough off. Well, this is not part of the syllabus, but I'm sure you will have a question. What if a fertilization takes place? Uh, and a growing embryo produces another hormone called the HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin. The function of this hormone is to maintain the corpus luteum so it won't degenerate. And as has been mentioned before, the function of the corpus luteum is to produce progesterone and estrogen. So I have put two green arrows on the progesterone and estrogen level rather than going down because of the corpus luteum is maintained intact. So the level of hormones for progesterone and estrogen remain high during this pregnancy. It is very important for the endometrium lining to remain intact because endometrium lining is the place where the placenta attaches itself, and so that the embryo can get the oxygen and nutrients from the mother. I hope now you know more about the details of the menstrual cycle. Of course, there will be some more questions and answer session in the class to clarify your understanding. So thank you so much for watching.